In a mere 5 minutes, Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts attempted to mute Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, with a $50,000 penalty. No proof, no debate, just an abuse of authority. Yet, he never anticipated this moment would backfire, ensnaring him instead. Confronted with fierce opposition, what was supposed to be a mundane hearing erupted into a gripping clash between political motives and unyielding truth. Armed with her wit and unwavering devotion to President Trump, this young woman rattled the foundations of the system. Before we dive into the tale, share where you're tuning in from in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to stay updated on the latest stories. It was a chilly morning in downtown Washington, D.C., with a gray sky overhead. The federal courthouse, on Constitution Avenue, was set for a short procedural session to examine an alleged breach of media regulations. But as Karoline Leavitt stepped inside, she instantly sensed something amiss. As Trump's quick-witted spokesperson, Leavitt was seasoned enough to detect when a room's mood felt orchestrated. The silence weighed heavily. Court staff averted their eyes. Even the walls seemed to observe her every move. Chief Justice John Roberts was already at the bench, his presence imposing, renowned for calculated decisions that favored control over discussion. He barely glanced at the documents before delivering a rapid verdict. His icy gaze tracked Leavitt as she entered, viewing her not as a White House official but as a hurdle to remove. The courtroom felt like a snare, with Leavitt at its core. The tension was palpable to all. The atmosphere wasn't merely strained, it was deliberately oppressive. Roberts wasn't there to uphold justice. He was there to assert dominance. His commanding aura seemed to sap the room's energy as he took his seat. Without pausing, without acknowledging the court, without so much as a glance at the counsel table, he settled in, sharply adjusting his judicial robe and fixing his eyes forward, his stare cold and detached. His voice cut through the air. "Lower. Court," he declared without hesitation. "The issue is settled. The defendant has violated the Federal Communications Act, Section 204. A $50,000 fine is imposed immediately. This is the court's ruling. No introduction, no reasoning, no due process, just a stark pronouncement, as if the case had been decided and sealed long before the doors swung open." Leavitt hadn't uttered a single word, her documents still, unopened, her hands resting lightly on the table, now subtly tensed yet composed. Across the room, federal prosecutor Michael Harper glanced up, his brow furrowed, shifting uncomfortably as if something critical had slipped past him. But there was nothing to overlook, because nothing had been presented. No arguments, no evidence. Not even the standard procedural prelude. Just a verdict, cold, final, unassailable. It felt like a judicial execution, and Leavitt was expected to submit, accept defeat, and walk away. But she refused. She began by seeking clarity. "Your Honor," she said cautiously, rising halfway from her seat. "With all due respect, the hearing hasn't started. I haven't been given the chance to present my case." Roberts's eyes narrowed, not in thought, but in annoyance. "That's unnecessary," he snapped. "You broke the law. There's nothing to debate." His tone wasn't merely dismissive, it was chilling, intentional, designed to shame her. This wasn't a legal oversight. It was a deliberate signal. Sit down, stay quiet, do not defy this court. Unlike most, Leavitt didn't falter. She showed no raised voice, no outward frustration. She stood firm, hands clasped before her, every gesture deliberate, controlled. Her heart might have raced beneath her tailored blazer, but outwardly, she was resolute. This composure wasn't mere instinct. It was forged through years of navigating, media scrutiny and political pressure alongside Trump. She understood that in a courtroom where authority was misused, restraint was her most potent weapon. Taking a deep breath, she spoke with precision and conviction. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I formally request the opportunity to present my defense. Free speech and due process require that I be heard." Her voice pierced the silence, not loud but steady and unmistakable. Her words carried a moral force, not merely a plea, but a bold assertion of an unassailable right. Yet John Roberts remained unmoved. He didn't feign consideration of her request. He stared directly at her, eyes narrowed, jaw clenched, as if her very words insulted him. Leaning forward, elbows on the bench, he raised his voice. "Miss Leavitt, this is not your platform. This is my courtroom, and I will not permit grandstanding or stalling tactics." His words struck like a whip, sharp, conclusive, tinged with personal disdain rather than legal skepticism. It was a veiled punishment, a warning to everyone watching. The courtroom had transformed into a theater of intimidation, with Leavitt as the focal point, yet she held her ground. She stood steadfast, like a monument under siege, outwardly serene but her mind racing, sharp and focused. This wasn't a legal proceeding. It was a choreographed power grab. Roberts wasn't safeguarding the law. He was wielding the bench like a crown. His tone, posture, and refusal to let her speak all revealed one truth. He had made up his mind long ago, and nothing she said would sway him. But this wasn't just about her case. It was about silencing her publicly, setting an example to deter White House aides, journalists, and Trump supporters in the gallery. "Dare to challenge me and I'll crush you without pause." Leavitt sensed it. The case had transcended an alleged media law violation. It was about her presence, her confidence, her refusal to back down. Roberts wasn't responding to the law. He was reacting to the strength in her voice, and now he sought to strip it away. Gradually, Prosecutor Michael Harper avoided her gaze. The court stenographer hesitated, fingers poised above the keyboard. The room's atmosphere was no longer impartial. It was antagonistic. Yet in that silence, Leavitt found clarity. Roberts had made one thing evident. He had no intention of granting her a fair hearing. He wasn't there to listen. He was there to dictate. Still, she didn't sit. She didn't surrender. Her voice grew softer, but more resolute. "Very well," she said, her eyes fixed on him. "We'll proceed on the record. Every word, every action, because if the law fails to protect me today, the truth will prevail. And every injustice demands a witness." That's when Leavitt acted, not with fury, not with rebellion, but with something far more threatening to someone like Chief Justice Roberts: lucidity. She had seen enough to grasp what was unfolding. This wasn't an error or haste. It was intentional suppression. She wasn't being penalized for violating a media law, but silenced for who she represented. Trump's steadfast spokesperson, a voice unbroken by political pressure. Everything in Roberts' courtroom was staged to deliver a message. "You don't belong here. You may be informed, but I wield the power." He held the gavel, but Leavitt possessed something greater: the truth and the force of public sentiment. As she retrieved documents from her briefcase, the room's mood shifted almost tangibly. The silence was no longer one of awe, it was one of expectation, like the hush before a pivotal moment. She laid the documents on the table before her, each page carefully prepared, like components of a mechanism only she knew how to wield. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady yet incisive, "let's discuss precedent, because what you're attempting has been challenged and overturned." She held up the first page. Citizens United vs. FEC 2010. An organization was accused of breaching campaign finance laws through political speech. No concrete documents, no verified reports, just vague claims. The case was appealed, and the Supreme Court ruled that curbing free speech was unconstitutional, nullifying the charges. She paused briefly, allowing the words to resonate, then continued. In its decision, the Supreme Court stated, "Free speech cannot be penalized based on assumptions. Due process requires clear evidence." Her voice remained steady, not for theatrics, but to advance her case point by point, argument by argument. She turned to the next page. Texas versus Johnson, 1989. An individual was fined for political expression. No tangible evidence, just the opinion of authorities. The court ruled the penalty violated the First Amendment, and every level of review affirmed that decision. She looked up slowly, her eyes locked on Roberts. That ruling was upheld at every stage. For the first time, Roberts stirred. It was subtle. His jaw tightened, his shoulders shifted slightly, but Leavitt noticed. So did others. Court stenographer Emily Carter typed with renewed vigor. Prosecutor Michael Harper uncrossed his legs, leaned forward, hands clasped, now more observer than advocate. Leavitt pressed forward, not physically, but with the weight of her argument. "You're imposing a $50,000 fine on me," she said, her voice more resolute, not louder, just clearer, without demanding evidence, without permitting arguments, without even commencing a hearing. She continued. "No documents, no witnesses, just your decree. With all due respect, Your Honor, that's not justice. It's authority cloaked as justice." A faint ripple of discomfort spread through the gallery. Reporters in the back rows exchanged quick glances as if silently asking, "Is she really saying this?" Yes, she was. And she wasn't finished. Leavitt lightly tapped her documents. "I reference these cases not as hypotheticals, but as a binding reminder of what this courtroom truly represents. When a judge disregards procedure, mutes the defense, and rules without evidence, they aren't upholding the law. They're breaking it. And I won't let that pass in silence." She stood motionless, her gaze fixed on Roberts, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet resonating like a storm. "You may dismiss my arguments, but you cannot erase precedent, and you will not rewrite the Constitution from that bench." At first, Roberts didn't react, but Leavitt saw the change. His jaw clenched tighter. His eyes briefly lost their sharp focus, flicking to Emily Carter, then to the prosecution table. His fingers, once resting calmly, began tapping slowly, unevenly. He was calculating, tense. Every move he'd made relied on control, intimidation, and the assumption that Leavitt would either yield or falter under pressure. But his foundation was crumbling. Leavitt wasn't merely defending herself. She was doing so with surgical precision, invoking Supreme Court rulings and constitutional principles he couldn't refute without undermining the judicial system he claimed to champion. That unnerved him more than any outburst. When his voice finally pierced the silence, it lacked its earlier authority. "The court will take a 15-minute recess," he said abruptly, then stood. No explanation, no acknowledgement, no eye contact. It was a retreat masked as procedure, a withdrawal veiled in judicial formality. Court staffer David quickly opened the door to the private chambers as John Roberts disappeared behind it, his judicial robe trailing like a barrier. The confidence he once projected was gone. But Karoline Leavitt understood precisely what had transpired. This wasn't a break to review evidence. It was a strategic retreat, a moment for him to regroup, make a call or devise a way to undermine her, derail her arguments or postpone the inevitable. Because now, he wasn't just facing a White House press secretary, he was facing accountability. The courtroom stayed frozen for a moment, as if uncertain whether it could exhale. Stenographer Emily Carter appeared shaken, her eyes darting toward Leavitt but not lingering. Prosecutor Michael Harper sat rigid, his fingers fidgeting, twisting in his lap. Meanwhile, Leavitt remained still, back straight, hands resting lightly on the stack of constitutional precedents she'd just unleashed, like a barrage of truth. She wasn't seeking applause. She was surveying the room, and what she saw was what Roberts dreaded. Doubt. Doubt seeping into the fissures of his authority, spreading among every silent onlooker who had just witnessed something rarely voiced in a courtroom, that even a Chief Justice could err, could be cornered. 15 minutes. That was the time, he requested. But Leavitt knew better. This wasn't a pause for reflection. It was a desperate attempt to salvage his position. He'd try to reframe the strategy, reshape the narrative, perhaps even summon reinforcements. Because a well-prepared spokesperson is formidable, but one who is fearless, rooted in truth, and unyielding under pressure is a force to be reckoned with. Leavitt had crossed a threshold most wouldn't dare near. She wasn't just seeking fairness, she was compelling the courtroom to face its own flaws, and Roberts, with all his prestige, had no strategy to counter that. As the clock ticked and the room settled into a fragile, uneasy silence, Leavitt stood firm, ready, focused, unshaken. The Chief Justice had retreated to safer ground, but she wasn't going anywhere. She'd remain until this courtroom rediscovered what it meant to uphold truth. When the door to the judge's chambers finally opened, every eye turned toward it, then narrowed in puzzlement. Roberts stepped in, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a tall, older man, his stride radiating the authority of a seasoned figure, Judge Samuel Coleman. His black robe seemed weightier than Roberts', bearing the gravitas of decades on the federal bench. The room's dynamic shifted instantly, not just due to another presence, but because of what it signified. A faint murmur of whispers rippled through the gallery, not curiosity but apprehension. Even court staffer David stood taller, as if realizing this case had spiraled beyond control, from a routine proceeding to an event poised to detonate. Leavitt needed no explanation. You don't bring in a judge like Samuel Coleman unless the situation is unraveling. And Roberts, despite his composed facade, was finally feeling the noose tighten. Roberts returned to the bench, his voice stripped of its former dominance. For the record, he said, clearing his throat, I have requested Judge Coleman to observe and, if needed, offer guidance on certain procedural matters that have emerged. It was a carefully worded statement, sounding formal, neutral, routine. But everyone in the room sensed the truth beneath it. He was losing his grip. And now he needed someone with greater authority to keep the proceedings from collapsing. Roberts avoided Leavitt's gaze. He couldn't face her, not after she had dismantled his position with razor-sharp precision. John Roberts leaned back, almost fading into the bench, allowing Samuel Coleman's presence to fill the void he could no longer command. Karoline Leavitt stood composed, but every sense was heightened, on full alert. She'd heard of Coleman, a former appellate judge, now a senior federal overseer known for his razor-sharp intellect, relentless cross-examination, and ability to command a courtroom with absolute authority. He didn't need to raise his voice. A single glance from him could overpower 100 objections, and now that glance settled on Leavitt, not hostile, but sharp as a blade, assessing not just her words, but her posture, her breathing, her silence. Leavitt understood the weight of this moment. She wasn't just defending herself against a biased ruling. She was on trial before the entire judicial system, but she didn't waver. She met Coleman's gaze, holding it a second longer than necessary. Her chin slightly raised, her presence solid as stone. She wasn't intimidated, but she was aware. This was no longer just a courtroom. It was a battlefield between entrenched legacy and reform, between self-appointed power and earned authority. Roberts had brought in Coleman to tip the scales, to use hierarchy to crush her voice. But Leavitt had something no robe could outweigh: constitutional precedent, airtight arguments, and an unassailable record of being right. This was no longer mere self-defense. This was a challenge to a system that had allowed Roberts to act unchecked. Coleman adjusted his robe, glanced at the file on the bench, then spoke. His voice was even, measured, but carried unmistakable force. Miss Leavitt, he said, you've raised several constitutional concerns regarding the application of the Federal Communications Act, Section 204. I'd like you to restate your core argument for the record. It wasn't a request. It was a test, a direct audit, and Leavitt knew it. She'd walked into a rigged courtroom, dismantled the trap, and now had to defend her truth under the federal spotlight. One misstep, and everything could collapse. But one right word, and she wouldn't just survive. She'd command the room. Looking down without a trace of hesitation, she responded, Yes, Your Honor. I'll begin with the violations of due process, supported by Supreme Court precedent. Her voice didn't just answer. It declared the rules had changed, the power had shifted, and Roberts knew it. Coleman was here to weigh the law, but the courtroom had tilted toward Leavitt. The air in the room settled into a cold, tense silence. Leavitt stood at the defense table, her hands lightly resting on the leather edge of her document folder. She didn't move as court staffer David called, Investigator Andrew Baxter, take the stand. From the back of the room, a man stood, his posture rigid with the confidence of someone who believed he owed no one an explanation. His gray suit was pristine, his Federal Communications Commission badge gleaming as if polished for this moment. He walked with the assurance of a man unchallenged for 2 decades. But that was about to change. Leavitt watched him with the calm precision of a surgeon. Baxter didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead, like someone checking off a form he'd filled out 100 times. He placed his left hand on the Bible, raised his right, recited the oath, then sat, hands clasped, waiting as if he already knew the outcome. Leavitt took 3 slow steps toward the witness stand. No rush, no theatrics, just enough to let him and everyone else feel the weight of what was coming. "Mr. Baxter," she began, her voice calm, not confrontational. "You're the one who filed the complaint leading to the fine against me, correct?" "That's correct, ma'am," he replied easily, almost too comfortably. Karoline Leavitt nodded slightly, her sharp gaze never leaving Andrew Baxter. "So, you observed the violation you're alleging, correct?" she asked, her voice even but heavy with intent. "Let's clarify that. Did you take photographs to document this violation?" Baxter shook his head. "No, ma'am. Wasn't necessary." Leavitt's voice didn't rise, but the room's atmosphere suddenly chilled. "Did you write a detailed report of the incident? Any diagrams sworn? Witness statements or time-stamped footage from security cameras?" "None of that was needed," Baxter replied with a slight shrug, his tone confident but starting to edge into defensiveness. "Was anyone else present at the time of the alleged violation?" Leavitt pressed. "I was there alone," Baxter answered. Leavitt paused for exactly 1 second, then slowly turned toward the gallery and the bench. Her words were slow, clear, each one carved with precision. "So, let me get this straight. You filed a complaint leading to a $50,000 fine based entirely on your personal judgment, with no photographs, no report, no third-party verification, and no supporting documentation whatsoever." "That's right," Baxter said, his voice now tinged with irritation. "I've been doing this for over 20 years. I know what a violation looks like." That was the moment his arrogance surfaced, the belief that experience equaled immunity. Leavitt gave a faint smile, restrained, calculated. "I'm sure you do, Mr. Baxter," she said, her voice soft but sharp as steel. "But we're not here to debate your feelings. We're here to talk about evidence." Baxter shifted slightly. Not overtly, but enough to reveal a crack in his confidence. She stepped closer. "Do you believe your personal opinion, unsupported by evidence, is enough to override a citizen's right to a fair hearing in a federal court?" Baxter's eyebrows furrowed. "I believe my experience allows me to make sound judgments in the field." "Judgments?" Leavitt repeated, her voice cooling. "But what about fines, penalties, legally binding consequences under the Constitution?" She turned toward the bench. "Your Honors, what we have here isn't law enforcement. It's assumption, not process. It's imposition. Mr. Baxter didn't observe a crime. He interpreted an action and treated his interpretation as law." She looked back at Baxter. "Can you point to anything in the complaint record? Any verifiable physical evidence?" "No, ma'am," he replied, his voice quieter. Leavitt didn't gloat. She let the silence speak. A long pause. Every eye was on her. She turned back to the bench, her voice sharper. "Your Honor Coleman, Your Honor Roberts, this investigator just admitted under oath that his entire complaint rests on subjective judgment, not probable cause, not statutory standards, just a feeling." She tapped her document lightly. Yet, a $50,000 fine was imposed, not based on evidence, not based on records, but on what one man thought he saw. Judge Samuel Coleman leaned forward, fingers interlaced. He said nothing, but his silence was no longer neutral. Leavitt stepped forward, her voice lowering. "This isn't about Mr. Baxter personally. It's about the standard we accept in a courtroom. If this is allowed to stand, if a fine can be imposed without a shred of actual evidence, then every citizen is one arbitrary ruling away from financial ruin. Because what Mr. Baxter calls enforcement, the Constitution calls tyranny, and the courts call unconstitutional." She turned to the gallery, her eyes sweeping across the faces. Some were stunned, others uneasy. A few young reporters in the back row looked as if they'd just been awakened, as if witnessing the imbalance being dismantled before their eyes. She turned back to Baxter. "One final question, Mr. Baxter. If someone challenges your complaint, as I'm doing now, what evidence would you present to defend your decision in court?" Karoline Leavitt looked at Andrew Baxter, then shifted her gaze to the two judges. Baxter hesitated, his throat moving as if swallowing tension. "I'd say I acted within the scope of my training and experience," he replied. "I see," Leavitt responded, her voice crisp as glass. "So we have a $50,000 fine based entirely on one man's recollection, with no physical evidence, no oversight." Then she delivered the line that cracked the courtroom open. "So, what you call a complaint, Mr. Baxter, is really just your opinion in a suit, a fine dressed up in the veneer of personal conviction." The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was electric, thick, charged. Everyone in the courtroom felt the weight of what she'd just said. The prosecution's case wasn't just weak, it was hollow. The Emperor had no clothes, and Leavitt had pointed it out with a surgeon's finesse. Judge Samuel Coleman leaned back, his gaze pensive. John Roberts stared down at the bench, lips pursed. Prosecutor Michael Harper stayed silent. He couldn't speak because any defense of Baxter now would only further confirm the case had veered off course. Leavitt stepped back, not retreating but concluding her message had landed. The system that tried to crush her now sat in stunned silence, confronting the simple truth she dragged into the light. You cannot punish without evidence. Not in this courtroom. Not today. Never again. Leavitt turned to the bench, her hands lightly resting on her documents, now open like a loaded weapon. Her voice lowered, not from lack of confidence, but because she wanted everyone in the room to lean in and listen. "Your Honors," she said, looking at Coleman first, then Roberts, "you've heard the legal precedent, you've seen the failure of process, but don't pretend this is just about paperwork." She continued, her voice steely. "This is about people, real people who never get the chance to stand in this courtroom. People crushed by invisible power, like I nearly was today." She slowly turned a page in her documents, then held it up. "Let me tell you about James Carter, a veteran in Boise, Idaho. He came back from Iraq with a shoulder injury and a dream to open an auto shop. For 20 years, he saved every penny, fixed engines by hand, helped other veterans for free when they were struggling. Then one day, a regulatory agency emailed him that his business license was suspended, not for safety violations, not for ethical breaches, but for a clerical error, a missing signature on an online application." She paused, letting the silence underscore the story. Robert's pen hovered over his paper but didn't write. The gallery was utterly still. He tried to appeal, but no one listened. They said the system automatically flagged his file. While he fought that invisible machine, customers left, rent piled up. 3 months later, James lost his shop, then his home. 6 months later, the agency admitted the error. "Do you know what they offered as compensation?" Leavitt's voice trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from restrained anger. "An email apology, unsigned." She turned to another page. "Maria Delgado, an electrician in Raleigh, North Carolina. 15 years on the job, no accidents, no violations. She trained apprentices, ran her own crew. Then one year, the city quietly changed licensing rules. Suddenly, her state license was deemed invalid under new city standards. No one could explain what that meant. Not the board, not the clerks. But they told her she couldn't pull wires, couldn't inspect, couldn't work. They said she had to start over, as if her career never existed. She fought, demanded clarity. Karoline Leavitt took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly, controlling not just her breath but the rhythm of the entire courtroom. She looked directly at John Roberts, her voice sharp as a surgical blade. "And what did they call that decision?" "Your Honor, standardization. That's the word they used. Cold, bureaucratic standardization." She paused, letting the words carve into the air. "Maria Delgado eventually moved to Virginia to start over. She lost her crew, her contracts, her home, her reputation, and no one was held accountable. She placed the final page atop her documents, her gaze sweeping the gallery before speaking. William Hayes, 62, a retired long-haul trucker living near Flagstaff, Arizona. He used his retirement savings to buy a small plot of land, built a pinewood fence by hand. The fence crossed an invisible city boundary line by 43 centimeters. The agency said he encroached on public land and fined him over $12,000. When he requested a land survey, they replied, "The matter has been decided." Leavitt's voice dropped, almost a whisper. He couldn't afford a lawyer, couldn't afford to appeal, so he tore down the fence himself in the heat, in the dust. It took 2 days. The courtroom was now a vacuum. No one stirred, no one coughed. Even Roberts stopped pretending to be busy. On the 3rd day, Leavitt continued, they fined him again for incomplete demolition because a few wooden posts remained in the ground. Everyone felt the weight of what she'd just brought to light. These weren't numbers. These were scars, proof that the system, when left to its own ego, became a predator. Leavitt shifted her full attention to Judge Samuel Coleman. So, let's stop pretending this is just a hearing about a minor fine. Let's stop pretending I'm the only one this has happened to. Her voice rose, not in anger, but in fierce conviction. What happened to James Carter, Maria Delgado, and William Hayes wasn't an accident. It wasn't a glitch. It was unchecked power, a system that can destroy lives without proving anything. And that's what almost happened to me today. She raised her hand, palm open. No evidence, no documents, no witnesses, just the opinion of an investigator in a courtroom, ready to rubber stamp without question. What if I hadn't brought these documents? What if I didn't know my rights? What if I just paid the fine like most people and walked away thinking I was wrong? She scanned the room. That's how injustice survives. It wears the mask of formal procedure and waits for no one to challenge it. That's how people give up. She looked back at Coleman, her voice low but ironclad. Unchecked power isn't justice. It's a loaded gun in the hands of those who forget who they serve. Then she delivered the final line, the one that left the courtroom on the edge of a precipice. Power that answers to no one doesn't protect people. It hunts them quietly, slowly, until one day it knocks on your door, and there's no one left to stand in its way. In the long moment after she finished, not a word was spoken because there was nothing left to say. The silence following Leavitt's final statement wasn't just heavy. It was suffocating. The kind of silence that envelops a courtroom like a storm about to break. John Roberts looked at her, his gaze lingering too long, his lips pressed into a rigid line, as if calculating the cost of what he was about to say. His fingers twitched slightly on the polished wood of the bench. He looked down, then up, and finally spoke, no longer with the commanding tone of before, but with a cold, calculated defiance. "This court," he said, his voice firm but hollow, "retains discretionary authority. We are not bound to accept every argument just because it's presented forcefully." He emphasized, when necessary, the court exercises its authority to maintain order and ensure compliance. That authority is not up for debate. But it was a thin veneer, a desperate attempt to reclaim power, not rooted in law, but in ego. The entire courtroom felt it. This wasn't justice speaking. This was a man clinging to the scraps of authority slipping through his fingers. He wasn't defending the ruling. He was defending himself. Karoline Leavitt didn't respond immediately. She let the air settle, let Robert's words hang in the awkward silence. Then she stepped forward, her voice lower but sharp as a blade cutting through the room. "Your Honor," she said, eyes locked on Roberts, "discretionary authority does not mean judicial supremacy. The power of that bench, of any bench, exists only within the boundaries of the law." She turned slightly, addressing the entire gallery. "Discretion is not a shield for error. It's not a sword for bias. It's a tool to be wielded carefully, never in place of evidence, and certainly never in place of truth." She turned back to Roberts, her voice hardening. "This fine was imposed with no documents, no physical evidence, no witnesses, based solely on an unverified claim from an investigator. You call it enforcement, but it's assumption. A $50,000 fine based on a feeling. That's not discretion. That's lawlessness cloaked in a judicial robe. Roberts' jaw tightened. For a moment, he seemed poised to retort, to raise his voice, or issue another sweeping declaration. But before he could, Judge Samuel Coleman leaned forward. "I've heard enough," Coleman said, not loudly, but with a weight that silenced everything else. "Miss Leavitt is correct. Discretionary authority cannot override constitutional standards. It cannot substitute truth with assumption." The statement hit the air like a hammer. The gallery froze. No whispers, no movement. Roberts didn't look at Coleman because he didn't need to. He knew what those words meant. The moment Coleman agreed, Roberts' entire argument collapsed. Coleman continued, his voice even but absolute. "In this case, we have no supporting documents, no corroborating witnesses, and no substantive evidence to justify the fine. The investigator's statement, unverified and unsupported, does not meet the evidentiary threshold required for enforcement." He paused, not for effect, but for clarity. "This court cannot and should not uphold a fine based solely on personal interpretation. If we do, we set a precedent not for justice, but for unchecked power." Roberts sat motionless, hands clasped, tightly before him. He didn't speak. He couldn't. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't dig the hole deeper. His authority had been challenged and dismantled in his own courtroom. He had tried to bypass process with prestige, precedent with posture. But now, in front of those he'd once intimidated with silence, he had no ground left to stand on. Finally, after a silence so long it was almost unbearable, Roberts leaned forward. His voice, when it came, was dry and strained. "This court," he began, eyes lowered, "finds insufficient evidence to sustain the fine under the Federal Communications Act, Section 204. He swallowed hard, his hands still not touching the gavel. "The fine is therefore vacated. The charge is dismissed." John Roberts' declaration to vacate the fine was not a triumphant victory, but an admission of defeat, an overreach by a system that nearly crushed someone simply because she refused to yield. Karoline Leavitt didn't move. She didn't smile, didn't nod. She stood there, calm, composed, as if the dismissal was inevitable. To her it was, not because the system worked correctly, but because she had forced it to. The gallery remained still, stunned. Prosecutor Michael Harper sat silent, hands clasped, eyes down. No one spoke, but everyone understood what had just happened. Leavitt hadn't just won a legal battle. She had exposed a rust in the system. She walked into a courtroom where everything was stacked against her: timing, prestige, reputation, even the judge. But she tore down those walls brick by brick. With nothing but truth, the Constitution, and clarity, John Roberts, who began the hearing with absolute authority, now sat silent, outmaneuvered, overwhelmed, outdone. In his silence, the message was clear. The court didn't rule for Leavitt. It surrendered to her resolve, her refusal to be erased. This wasn't just a fine vacated. It was a system reminded of its purpose. The courtroom sank into a profound stillness so deep that even the hum of the overhead lights seemed to pause in reverence for what had transpired. The morning had begun with the tension of a routine administrative hearing, a case meant to be a footnote in a ledger. But over the hours, the atmosphere had transformed into a crucible of power, bias, and unrelenting truth. Now, with the final ruling delivered, the weight of injustice still hung in the air. The scene before the judges, attorneys, and silent witnesses was a shift that could not be undone. John Roberts, who once spoke with unchallenged authority, now sat motionless. Behind the bench, eyes fixed on the worn wood before him, the power he clung to had evaporated in the face of Karoline Leavitt's relentless demand for due process. In that charged moment, as the courtroom seemed frozen in time, a reckoning with truth had begun. A truth that could not be silenced by power, no matter how cloaked in majesty. After a silence that felt eternal, Roberts finally lifted his eyes, meeting Leavitt's unwavering gaze. His voice, once resonant with authority, was now a tense whisper, almost defeated. "I underestimated you." Those words, quiet but laced, with bitterness, cut through the stifling silence like shattered glass. They weren't for the public. They were a private admission of his failure to anticipate her resolve. Leavitt, standing tall before the courtroom, let a subtle smile flicker at the corner of her lips, not triumph, but quiet confirmation. "You're not the first, Your Honor," she replied softly, her voice carrying a calm defiance that echoed to every person present. In that fleeting moment, the room's dynamic shifted irreversibly. The weight of unchallenged power lifted slightly, replaced by a new awareness that true justice demands more than authority. It demands accountability. The courtroom sank into a bitter silence, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the collective realization that what had just transpired went beyond a legal victory. It was the birth of a precedent that would echo far beyond these walls. Without another word, Leavitt turned from the bench. Each step she took down the marble aisle was measured, her heels clicking in a steady rhythm like the pulse of a revolution. Every step Karoline Leavitt took was a testament to countless hours of preparation, battles fought in smaller rooms, and courage summoned in moments when the weight of injustice threatened to crush the spirit of the vulnerable. The gallery watched her in silent awe as she passed the hushed rows, where many now realized they hadn't just witnessed a legal ruling, but a transformation in the very fabric of the system. Her steady march was a silent proclamation that even when power is abused and the scales of justice are tipped by unchecked authority, the voice of truth can rise to reclaim what is rightfully its own. Beyond the corridor of the federal courthouse on Constitution Avenue, her footsteps echoed, reaching far beyond the scope of a single trial. The daylight flooding through the grand entrance felt symbolic, like a metaphor for transparency and hope, piercing the fog of hidden corruption and abuse. As Leavitt reached the heavy oak doors, she paused for a moment. She glanced back one final time at the room where John Roberts' defeat was etched in every crease on his forehead, in every silent nod from those who dared to stand with her. In that fleeting moment, the eyes of everyone, from stenographer Emily Carter to seasoned attorneys, were witness to an undeniable truth. The law is not a tool of oppression, but a shield for the people. The door creaked open, and with one final, resolute step, Leavitt stepped outside, bathed in the gentle, forgiving light. The noise of the outside world rushed back, as if acknowledging the magnitude of what had just occurred. But within her, this victory was complex. It wasn't celebrated with cheers or glory. Instead, it was a precedent carved into the annals of this courtroom, shaping every future case where power threatens to override justice. The injustice she faced was not unique. It was systemic, rooted in a culture of unchecked authority that had long silenced the marginalized. But by standing firm and demanding accountability, Leavitt had paved the way for change. Her actions today were a reminder that true power lies, not in silencing dissent, but in the courage to confront it head-on. Every detail of this day would be remembered. Robert's cold, calculated tone as he imposed the stifling tension that filled every corner of the room, and the way the gallery held its breath when the final ruling was announced. Those moments, seemingly small but infinitely significant, were the sparks that could ignite a broader movement for justice. The injustice of an evidenceless fine, the arrogance of a system presuming guilt without proof. To Leavitt, these were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger story. Now, because of her resolve, that story had been disrupted. A subtle but undeniable shift had taken root. Judges who once ruled with an iron hand might now pause before issuing rulings without due process. Prosecutors, once content to operate within an unjust system, might find themselves challenged by the very precedents they once dismissed. And every citizen who has felt the sting of arbitrary power, those who lost livelihoods, dignity, or even their homes, now has a beacon of hope. In Leavitt's quiet defiance, in her unrelenting demand for truth, lies the promise of accountability. The law, when unchecked, becomes a weapon, a tool for the powerful to crush the weak. But when wielded by those who honor its principles, the law becomes a shield. Today, Karoline Leavitt showed the world just how strong that shield can be. She didn't just defend herself, but stood for those without a voice, cementing her place as a symbol of resistance within the Trump administration and leaving an indelible mark in the fight against systemic injustice. As the courtroom slowly emptied, whispers began to rise. Soft at first, then growing louder as if people were trying to process the miracle they'd just witnessed. Some murmured about the shock of the moment, a Chief Justice admitting error, a system crumbling under the weight of its own hypocrisy. Others spoke of Karoline Leavitt's courage with reverence, debating what her actions meant for future cases. Every whisper, every exchanged glance reinforced one truth. This was no ordinary dismissal. It was a turning point, a pivot in the long fight against systemic injustice. Even Judge Samuel Coleman, who maintained calm authority throughout the proceedings, seemed to exude a quiet resolve. His eyes, which had once tracked Leavitt's every move with cold precision, now glinted with faint satisfaction, as if silently confirming that the scales of justice, at least in this case, had been righted. John Roberts, forced to issue the ruling vacating the fine, had played out his role in this drama. His final declaration, "The fine is vacated, the charge is dismissed," was not a victory, but an admission that his initial assertions could not stand. It was as if he'd been caught twisting the law, and with no way out, he was forced to retreat in defeat. In the weeks that followed, the reverberations of that day reached far beyond the walls of the federal courthouse. Legal journals cited the case as a pivotal moment in administrative law, a stark example of how unchecked power can be dismantled by a resolute voice standing for what's right. Law schools discussed it as a turning point in interpreting judicial discretion, and practicing attorneys recounted the day as the moment the spirit of due process was defended with unwavering conviction. But for Leavitt, the victory's meaning was deeply personal. It wasn't just about vacating a fine. It was about reclaiming dignity eroded over years by systemic bias and bureaucratic indifference. Every step she took that day, from entering the courtroom to the final echo of her heels as she left, testified to the power of perseverance. It was a reminder that the law, in its purest form, is not a tool of oppression, but a mechanism for justice, ensuring every individual, regardless of background or status, is judged fairly. As she stepped out of the federal courthouse, the world outside seemed to breathe a little easier, as if the weight of injustice had been momentarily lifted. Leavitt's journey wasn't over. There would be other battles, other moments when the system would try to silence reason with bureaucratic might. But that day, in the hallowed space of justice, she proved something essential. Even the most entrenched power can be challenged. The law is not an inviolable decree of the powerful, but a living promise to protect the vulnerable. That's the promise Leavitt reaffirmed with every word, every cited precedent, every measured step. As the heavy courtroom doors closed behind her, sealing the space where history had just been rewritten, a quiet resolve flooded the corridor. The echo of her steadfast stance would linger in those walls, a reminder that when power goes unchecked, it becomes a weapon. But when questioned, when held accountable, that power can be harnessed to uplift and protect. A precedent had been set, not with celebratory fanfare, but with Karoline Leavitt's steady, unyielding march. Her victory was not just a blow to efforts to silence the Trump administration, but a spark of hope for those the system had abandoned. As the afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the federal courthouse on Constitution Avenue, casting long, dramatic shadows across the marble floor, those present felt the shift. The scales of justice, if only for a moment, had tipped toward accountability. There were no cheers of triumph, but it was a victory nonetheless. A victory of conscience over corruption, of evidence over assumption, of due process over arbitrary discretion. Karoline Leavitt left the courtroom not as a proud conqueror, but as someone who had borne the weight of injustice and, by standing firm, had lifted a small corner of it. Her gaze carried a promise of future battles, a silent vow that she would never let unchecked power trample anyone's rights. As the courthouse doors closed behind her, sealing the echoes of that fateful day, the legacy of her courage began to seep into every crevice of the legal system. It was a legacy that reminded future generations that no one stands above the law, And sometimes the greatest victories are the precedents that force the system to change. In the days, months, and years that followed, those who witnessed the hearing would speak of it with a mix of reverence and caution. Legal scholars debated its implications, citing the case as evidence of what happens when a judge's discretionary authority is finally held accountable. Young attorneys carried the memory of that day as a beacon, a reminder that the law can be both sword and shield when wielded with integrity. For those who had felt powerless against bureaucratic overreach, Leavitt's steadfast stand became a symbol, proof that even in the darkest moments, a voice grounded in truth can alter the course of history. The courtroom didn't just witness a ruling, it witnessed a transformation of power, of process, and of the collective understanding of what it means to serve justice. Though John Roberts' final words were spoken with the faint voice of defeat, the message echoing through the courthouse corridors was undeniable. Justice without evidence and due process is an empty shell. That system had to be questioned, held accountable, and ultimately reformed. Leavitt's quiet departure was not an end, but the beginning of a new chapter, one where every ruling would be scrutinized, every fine justified, and every enforcement action grounded in verifiable truth. As she blended into the fading light outside, her silhouette merging with the courthouse's shadow, she left an indelible mark on the hearts and minds of everyone present that day. It was a reminder that though the fight against systemic injustice may be long and arduous, each victory, each precedent, brings us closer to a world where power is truly restrained and every individual receives the respect and protection they deserve. The day ended not with a roar of triumph, but with a solemn acknowledgement of a hard truth. True justice is not dispensed at a judge's whim, but earned through courage, relentless scrutiny, and an unwavering refusal to let power run unchecked. Karoline Leavitt didn't just reclaim her dignity. She reignited a flame to guide those who believe the law must serve the people, not the other way around. In the weeks following Leavitt's landmark victory, a wave of change began to ripple across cities nationwide. Federal administrative offices, long reliant on unchecked discretionary authority, suddenly faced demands to review hundreds of similar complaints and fines. Leavitt's case became a focal point on platforms where the public hailed her as a symbol of resistance against a biased system, especially amid the tense political climate surrounding the Trump administration. Reporters and commentators dubbed her the spokesperson who beat the system. While legal reform advocates began pushing for stricter regulations on media law enforcement, Leavitt's legacy didn't just live in the courtroom. It sparked a movement for transparency and justice nationwide. It started in a small Midwestern city, where a local attorney investigated a $50,000 arbitrary fine and uncovered hundreds of similar complaints imposed based solely on an investigator's personal judgment. City by city, from Des Moines to Atlanta, officials were forced to dig through old records and examine enforcement practices long shrouded in bureaucratic secrecy. The findings were shocking. Thousands of citizens financially ruined by fines lacking physical documentation, witness testimony, or objective standards. Public outrage erupted as people realized these fines weren't isolated administrative errors, but part of a systemic failure that allowed unchecked power to run rampant. The truth sent shockwaves through federal agencies and local governments, now facing intense public scrutiny and urgent calls for transparency and reform. Officials scrambled to explain why fines were imposed based solely on an investigator's opinion without verifiable evidence, but many were swept up in the public's anger. Within weeks, the narrative shifted from isolated incidents to a nationwide reckoning with administrative overreach. Karoline Leavitt's victory in that fateful courtroom became the spark that ignited a national reform movement. Her case, meticulously documented and sharply argued, was cited by legal scholars and activists as a turning point. Soon, federal agencies and local governments across the United States began reviewing records. In some cities, hundreds of fines were vacated when it was revealed they were imposed without sufficient evidence. In boardrooms and city council meetings, officials faced the bitter truth. A system that allowed fines based on personal opinion rather than verified truth was flawed and dangerous. Community organizations mobilized, demanding stricter guidelines for evidence-based enforcement and holding investigators accountable for arbitrary decisions. The momentum of this movement was so powerful that communities, once powerless against bureaucratic overreach, now found their voices amplified. Public forums erupted in protests, with citizens demanding transparency and guarantees that no one would face consequences from an investigator's unchecked discretion. With each new policy review, each vacated fine, Leavitt's case was cited as a beacon of hope, a reminder that when people demand accountability, even the mightiest institutions can be forced to change. As the story spread, the media continued to shine a light on the unfolding reforms. Television networks, newspapers, and online platforms like X buzzed with coverage. Major news programs returned with follow-up reports on sweeping audits documenting how cities in Texas, California, and New York grappled with the fallout of a bus site system long left unchecked. Tens of thousands of fines, ranging from a few hundred to tens of thousands of dollars, had been wrongly imposed over the past decade, as reports continued to reveal. Each story told on 60 Minutes and other platforms made it clearer that the issue wasn't isolated but systemic, demanding urgent reform. The public was galvanized, and pressure mounted on federal and local officials to explain, justify, and ultimately change the flawed processes that led to countless unjust fines. For Karoline Leavitt, the impact of her courtroom victory was not only profound but far-reaching. She didn't just defend her own rights, she laid a cornerstone in the edifice of American justice. Leavitt's case became a catalyst for reform, a turning point that exposed the dangers of unchecked administrative power and ignited a nationwide movement to protect citizens from arbitrary enforcement. Legal experts began calling her case a historic precedent, a reminder that the law must always be grounded in evidence, transparency, and fairness. Law schools incorporated her arguments into curricula, teaching a new generation of lawyers the importance of fighting for due process. Conferences and seminars buzzed with discussions about the need for stricter oversight of administrative enforcement, and policymakers nationwide cited her case as a reason to overhaul outdated practices. Leavitt's resolve transformed a personal battle into a broader crusade for justice, ensuring every citizen was better protected from abuses of power. Across the United States, communities, once silenced by bureaucratic indifference, now found their voice. The reforms sparked by her case brought hope to those who had suffered under a system that prioritized authority over fairness. With each vacated fine and revised policy, the vision of a fairer system began to take shape. Leavitt's legacy of victory didn't lie in loud proclamations or fleeting moments of glory. It was etched into the daily lives of citizens, no longer forced to live in fear of arbitrary punishment. That legacy became a beacon for future generations, a reminder that unchecked power is only a threat to the rights of the people. But when challenged, held accountable, and reformed, that power can become a force for good, upholding the founding principles of the United States. Ultimately, Leavitt did more than win a legal battle. She altered the course of history. Her courage in the face of injustice inspired a movement to scrutinize and reform a system tainted by arbitrary fines and unverified complaints. Her victory was not a singular moment of glory, but a spark that ignited sweeping reform, reshaping how administrative power is exercised, ensuring every penalty is grounded in evidence and enforced fairly. In doing so, Leavitt laid a new cornerstone in American justice, a testament to the enduring power of truth, accountability, and the unrelenting resolve of those who dare to stand against oppression. Her story became a rallying cry for every citizen who ever felt powerless, a symbol that when you question authority, demand evidence, and stand firm in due process, you truly can change the world. Though the road ahead remains long and challenging, Karoline Leavitt's legacy shines as a reminder that the fight for justice is never over. And even the smallest voice can echo loudly enough to reshape a nation. The story of Karoline Leavitt's fight against an evidenceless $50,000 fine in a Washington, D.C. courtroom reflects real-world issues Americans face today. Administrative overreach and a lack of transparency in the legal system. Leavitt's journey from confronting Chief Justice John Roberts to sparking a nationwide reform movement is a testament to the power of an individual standing against injustice. In today's context, when federal and local agencies sometimes impose regulations without clear justification, such as traffic fines, administrative violations, or media regulations, Leavitt's story offers a profound lesson. It reminds us that free speech and due process, as Leavitt defended, are the bedrock of a just society. The practical takeaway from this story is, don't be afraid to ask questions and demand evidence when facing an administrative decision. Leavitt used her knowledge of the Federal Communications Act and sharp arguments to challenge investigator Andrew Baxter, forcing the court to acknowledge the lack of evidence. Americans today can apply this by researching their rights through resources like government websites or free legal aid organizations and demanding transparency when confronted with fines or complaints. Moreover, the Leavitt legacy movement on social media shows the power of community in amplifying individual voices, encouraging people to join public forums or social platforms to share experiences and demand reform. Finally, as Leavitt demonstrated by telling the stories of James Carter and Maria Delgado, connecting personally with those affected by injustice can drive systemic change. Stay resolute, seek the truth, and unite. That's how each person can contribute to building a fairer America. Thank you for joining Karoline Leavitt's story in her fight for justice. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next inspiring stories. See you in the upcoming video, where we continue to explore the voices changing the world.